Welcome to the galactic penitentiary of Zorblex Prime, a fortress so impenetrable that even the guy who designed it couldn't figure out how to escape from it. And trust me, he tried, for 47 years, but we'll get to that later. The prison floated in the void like a massive metal donut, spinning lazily through space while housing the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. Well, supposedly dangerous. Half of them were in there for tax evasion, but the Galactic Council had a real flair for the dramatic. Warden Grixtal strutted through the Central Command Center on his 6 spindly legs, his purple carapace gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was the kind of alien who wore his authority like an expensive suit, constantly adjusting it to make sure everyone noticed. His compound eyes swept across the monitoring screens showing endless rows of cells, each containing some poor soul who'd had the misfortune of annoying the wrong bureaucrat. 847 years. Grixtal announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying that special brand of smugness reserved for middle management. 847 years without a single successful escape. Do you know what that means, Lieutenant Korb? Lieutenant Korb, a nervous slug-like creature manning the communications console, made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been indigestion. With Korb, it was always hard to tell. It means, Grixtal continued, not waiting for an actual answer, that this prison is absolutely, completely, 100% escape-proof. Nothing gets out of here. Nothing. That's when the universe decided to have a little fun with Warden Grixtal's ego. The transport ship that docked at Bay 7 was unremarkable in every way. Standard cargo hauler, 3rd-class registration. The kind of vessel that screamed, "I'm definitely not smuggling anything illegal," so loudly that it practically guaranteed a search. Which is exactly what happened to one Jake Morrison, small-time smuggler and professional disappointment to his mother. Jake wasn't particularly impressive to look at. Average height, brown hair that hadn't seen a comb in weeks, and the kind of face that could disappear in a crowd of 3 people. He wore a battered leather jacket that had seen better decades, and carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd never met a rule he couldn't bend. The charge against him was almost embarrassingly mundane. Transporting unlicensed Rigelian coffee beans across 3 star systems. Not weapons, not drugs, not even counterfeit currency. Coffee beans. The Galactic Council took their beverage regulations very seriously. A human, Grixtal mused as he reviewed Jake's file on his tablet. How quaint. We haven't had one of those in... Oh, what's it been, Korb? 200 years? 237, sir, Korb replied, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd been asked this question many times before. Grixtal's mandibles clicked together in what passed for a smile among his species. Fascinating creatures, humans. So primitive, so limited. Did you know they only have 2 arms? 2! And they can't even see in the dark properly. He paused, studying Jake's image on the screen. I think we'll put this one in Block C, for entertainment value. And that, dear listeners, was Warden Grixtal's first mistake. Not his biggest mistake, mind you, that would come later, but definitely his first. As Jake was processed through the standard intake procedure, stripped of his belongings, and issued the standard prison jumpsuit that somehow managed to be both too big and too small simultaneously, he took mental notes of everything around him. The guard rotations, the security protocols, the way the other prisoners moved through the corridors like they'd given up hope sometime during the previous century. "Welcome to paradise," muttered the guard escorting Jake to his cell, a crystalline being whose voice sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Hope you brought something to read, because you're going to be here for a very, very long time." Jake just smiled and said nothing. After all, he'd only been in the place for 20 minutes, and he was already starting to see the cracks in their supposedly perfect system. 847 years without an escape? Well, that was about to change. Jake's cell was what you might generously call cozy, if you were the kind of person who thought a coffin was spacious. The walls were made of some kind of energy-dampening alloy that hummed constantly, like a refrigerator with anxiety issues. But it wasn't the accommodations that caught Jake's attention. It was his roommates. "Oh, wonderful," grumbled a voice from the top bunk. "Another mouth-breather." Jake looked up to see a creature that appeared to be having an argument with itself, and winning. Vex was a Kandorian, which meant he had 4 arms, purple skin, and the kind of perpetual scowl that suggested he'd been having a bad day for the past several decades. He was currently using 2 hands to work on some kind of electronic device, while the other 2 gestured wildly as he muttered to himself. "Don't mind Vex," came a squeaky voice from somewhere near Jake's ankles. "He's been trying to build a plasma cutter out of food dispensers for the last 15 years. Still hasn't figured out that the power cells are dampened." Jake looked down to see what appeared to be a very angry hamster wearing tiny battle armor. This was Nibbler, a Squirrelian warrior who stood exactly 14 inches tall and had supposedly single-handedly destroyed 3 enemy battalions before being captured. The fact that he now had to ask for help reaching the soap dispenser was, according to his file, a source of considerable embarrassment. "And over there," Nibbler continued, pointing with a claw the size of a toothpick, "is Gordak." Gordak was impossible to miss, mainly because he took up roughly half the cell. He was a boulderite, which meant he looked like someone had taught a mountain to feel sad. His species was known for their incredible strength and their even more incredible ability to overthink every situation into complete paralysis. He was currently staring at the wall with the intensity of someone trying to solve the meaning of life through pure concentration. "He designed this place," Nibbler whispered conspiratorially, "back when he was chief engineer for the Galactic Council. Then he got framed for embezzlement and ended up as a guest in his own creation. Bit of a career setback, really." 47 years, Gordak rumbled in a voice like distant thunder. 47 years I've been trying to find a flaw in my own design. But I built it too well. Every weakness I identify, I remember why I eliminated it during construction." Jake sat down on his bunk, which squeaked in protest, and studied his new roommates. Here was a demolitions expert who'd been working on the same project for 15 years, a warrior the size of an action figure and an architect trapped by his own perfectionism. It was like watching a very depressing episode of a home improvement show. "So," Jake said casually, "anyone ever tried just walking out?" The cell went silent, even the humming walls seemed to pause. "Walking out," Vex repeated, his 4 hands stopping their work for the first time since Jake had arrived. "Walking out? Oh, that's brilliant. Why didn't we think of that? Just stroll past the energy barriers, the motion sensors, the guard patrols, the automated defense systems, and the fact that we're floating in the middle of space." "I'm just saying," Jake continued, completely unfazed by the sarcasm. "Sometimes the simplest solution is the right one." Nibbler made a sound that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so bitter. "Simple? Human? This prison was designed by someone who thought of everything. Every possible escape route, every potential weakness, every conceivable flaw. It's mathematically impossible to escape from here. Plus," Vex added, waving his device in the air, "even if you somehow made it past all the security measures, you'd still need to deal with the guards, and they're not exactly the understanding type." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "What about the other prisoners? How do they feel about being stuck here forever?" "The same way we do," Gordak replied. "Hopeless, defeated, resigned to their fate. The Zephyrethians in Block A haven't spoken to anyone in 60 years. The Crystalline Collective in Block B spends their time writing poetry about the futility of existence. And don't even get me started on the hive minds in Block D. They've been having the same argument with themselves for the past century." "Sounds like morale is pretty low," Jake observed. "Morale," Nibbler squeaked. "What's morale? Is that something you can eat? Because I haven't seen any of that around here lately." Jake stood up and walked to the cell door, pressing his face against the energy barrier. The corridor beyond was filled with the sounds of despair, alien voices muttering in languages he didn't recognize, the occasional sob echoing off the metal walls, and the constant shuffling of feet that had forgotten how to hurry. "You know what I think," Jake said, turning back to his cellmates. "I think you've all been overthinking this." Vex's forearms stopped moving entirely. Nibbler's tiny jaw dropped. Gordak's massive head slowly turned to stare at the human. "Overthinking," Vex sputtered. "Overthinking? This is the most secure prison in the galaxy. You can't just underthink your way out of here." Jake smiled. It was the kind of smile that made his mother nervous and his parole officer reach for his antacids. Want to bet? And that, dear listeners, was when Jake Morrison decided to introduce his new friends to a very human concept, the art of not giving a damn about impossible odds. The next morning, Jake woke up to find Vex already working on his plasma cutter project, muttering about quantum frequencies and energy displacement ratios. Meanwhile, Nibbler was doing what appeared to be the galaxy's tiniest workout routine, and Gordak was staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone trying to remember where he'd left his keys 47 years ago. "So," Jake said, stretching and yawning, "what time do the guards usually do their rounds?" "Every 2 hours and 14 minutes, Gordak replied automatically. Staggered patrol pattern, overlapping coverage zones, no blind spots. I designed it to be completely predictable and completely unavoidable. And they stick to that schedule religiously? Of course. Military precision. The Galactic Council doesn't hire slackers. Jake nodded and then did something that hadn't been done in the galactic penitentiary of Zorblex Prime for nearly 9 centuries. He started paying attention to the guards as people, not security measures. Guard Captain Thok was a reptilian who took his job very seriously, which is to say he took himself very seriously. He strutted through the corridors like he was personally responsible for maintaining order in the universe, but Jake noticed something interesting about Captain Thok. Every time he passed the mess hall, he slowed down. Every time he passed the recreation area, he glanced longingly at the holo screen showing the latest episodes of Galactic Housewives of Centauri Prime. Folks bored out of his mind, Jake mentioned casually during lunch, which consisted of something that might have been food, if you were very generous with your definition. So, Vex replied, not looking up from his meal, we're all bored. That's what prison is for. Yeah, but he's not supposed to be bored. He's supposed to be alert, professional. But instead, he's daydreaming about soap operas and whatever passes for donuts in his species. Nibbler paused mid-chew. How do you know that? Because I watched him. For 10 minutes he stood outside the mess hall just staring at the dessert dispenser. Then he shook his head and walked away. Classic behavior of someone on a diet who's about to crack. I fail to see how this is relevant to our situation, Gordak rumbled. Jake grinned. It's relevant because Captain Thok isn't a security system. He's a person, and people have weaknesses. Over the next few days, Jake did something that confused his cellmates and would have given Warden Grickstall a migraine if he'd bothered to notice. He started being friendly to the guards. Not suspiciously friendly, not obviously manipulative, just human-friendly. He remembered their names. He asked about their families. He made small talk about the weather, even though they were in space, and there wasn't any weather to speak of. "Morning, Sergeant Blurks," Jake called out cheerfully as the gelatinous guard oozed past their cell. "How's the new baby doing?" Sergeant Blurks, who hadn't been asked about his personal life in approximately 2 decades, stopped mid-ooze. She's doing well, actually. Started her first molt yesterday." "That's great. I bet you're proud." Yes, I am." And just like that, Sergeant Blurks started taking an extra few seconds during his rounds to chat with the friendly human, which meant his timing was off by those few seconds, which meant the carefully orchestrated patrol schedule that Gordak had designed was developing tiny, almost imperceptible gaps. "This is ridiculous," Vex muttered after watching Jake compliment Guard Lieutenant Zaps on his new tentacle polish. "You're not accomplishing anything. You're just talking to them." "Exactly," Jake replied. "When was the last time anyone in here treated the guards like actual beings, instead of obstacles to overcome?" The question hung in the air like a bad smell. The answer, of course, was never. But Jake was just getting started. He began noticing things that his cellmates had overlooked for decades, like how the afternoon shift guards always seemed slightly off balance because they'd just eaten lunch, or how the night shift guards got chatty around hour 6 of their 8-hour rotation because they were fighting off sleep. "You know what your problem is?" Jake said to Vex one afternoon, as the 4-armed alien worked on recalibrating his plasma cutter for the 1000th time. "You're trying to solve this like an engineer." "I am an engineer," Vex replied flatly. "Right, but engineers think in terms of systems and specifications. You're trying to build a device that can cut through energy barriers, override security protocols, and disable alarm systems all at once. You want to out-tech the technology. That's literally what escape requires." "Says who?" Vex's 4 hands stopped moving. Says logic. Says physics. Says the fundamental nature of prison security." Jake picked up one of Vex's discarded components, a small power cell that had been drained and recharged so many times it barely held a charge anymore. "What if I told you that this little thing, right here, could shut down the entire security grid for Block C?" "I'd say you're delusional." "Watch and learn." Jake stood up and walked to the cell door. When Guard Captain Thok made his scheduled appearance, Jake held up the power cell and said, "Hey, Captain, I think one of my bunkmates might have accidentally damaged some prison property. Should I report this to maintenance, or do you want to handle it?" Captain Thok, who had been trained to investigate any potential security breach immediately, stopped and examined the power cell through the energy barrier. "Where did you get this?" "Found it under Vex's bunk. He's been working on some kind of electronic project. Probably nothing dangerous, but I thought you should know." 20 minutes later, Captain Thok had called in a maintenance team to inspect the cell's power systems. During the inspection, the security grid for Block C was temporarily disabled, just for 15 minutes, just for routine maintenance. But 15 minutes was enough for Jake to wave at the prisoners in the cells across the corridor, to make eye contact, to mouth the words, tomorrow, same time, to 3 different species who hadn't communicated with outsiders in years. That, Jake said to his stunned cellmates after the guards had left, is what we call social engineering. No fancy gadgets required. Nibbler stared at him with something approaching awe. You got them to turn off their own security system. I got them to follow their own procedures. There's a difference. Gordak's massive head tilted slightly. But how did you know they would react that way? Jake shrugged. Because they're not machines, they're people doing a job. And people doing jobs have protocols to follow, supervisors to answer to, and a basic desire to avoid getting blamed for things going wrong. For the first time in 47 years, Gordak smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible on his Balder-like features, but it was there. You know what? The massive architect said quietly. I think I've been approaching this all wrong. And that, dear listeners, was the moment when the inmates of the galactic penitentiary of Zorblex Prime learned that sometimes the best way to break the system is to make it work exactly as designed. By day 3 of Jake's residency, word had spread through the prison's informal communication network that something was happening in Block C. Not the usual someone's planning something that will fail spectacularly kind of something, but actual, genuine, holy nebula, did you see what that human just did kind of something. The incident that started it all happened during the weekly gladiator matches in the recreation area. Now these weren't actual gladiator matches, of course. The Galactic Council had banned blood sports centuries ago, after the unfortunate incident involving the carnivorous fluffballs of Sigma Draconis. Instead, they were competitive physical therapy sessions, where prisoners could work out their aggression by hitting each other with foam weapons while the guards placed bets on the outcome. Jake had volunteered to participate, much to the amusement of everyone present. The human stood in the center of the arena, holding a foam sword that looked ridiculously oversized in his hands, facing off against Crunch, a hammer-fist warrior who stood 8 feet tall and had biceps the size of small moons. This should be entertaining, chuckled Guard Lieutenant Zeps, tentacles writhing with anticipation. I give the human about 30 seconds before he's paced. But Jake wasn't looking at Crunch. He was looking at the crowd. More specifically, he was looking at the way different species had automatically segregated themselves into their own little groups. The Zephyrians clustered together in their silent, judgmental way. The Crystalline Collective hummed in harmonious disapproval. The hive minds argued among themselves about the ethical implications of watching violence for entertainment. Hey, Crunch, Jake called out, not bothering to raise his weapon. Before we start, can I ask you something? Crunch, who had been psyching himself up for battle, paused mid-roar. What? How long have you been in here? 93 years. Why? 93 years of fighting in these matches. How many have you won? All of them, Crunch replied proudly, puffing out his massive chest. All of them. And what did you get for winning? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Crunch's expression shifted from confident to confused. I got respect. Fear. Other prisoners know not to mess with me. Right, but here's the thing, Crunch. You're still in prison. We're all still in prison, so maybe, just maybe, instead of fighting each other, we should be fighting the system that put us here. Jake dropped his foam sword. It hit the arena floor with a soft thud that somehow sounded louder than any war cry. What are you doing? Crunch demanded. I'm refusing to play their game. This whole gladiator thing? It's not for us. It's for them. Jake pointed at the guards, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable. They get entertainment, we get exhausted beating each other up instead of thinking about escape. It's brilliant, really. Evil, but brilliant. Crunch looked around the arena, then at the guards, then back at Jake. His massive brain, which had been focused on combat for nearly a century, suddenly clicked into a different mode entirely. You're saying we're being manipulated. I'm saying we're being managed. There's a difference, but not a good one. Crunch dropped his weapon, too. Then, in a voice that carried throughout the recreation area, he said something that hadn't been heard in the galactic penitentiary of Zorblex Prime for 847 years. I forfeit. The effect was immediate and electric. Prisoners who had been watching the match with bored resignation suddenly sat up straighter. Species that hadn't spoken to each other in decades started making eye contact. Even the hive minds stopped arguing with themselves long enough to pay attention. But Jake wasn't done. He walked over to the viewing area and did something that nearly gave Guard Captain Thok a heart attack. He started talking to all the prisoners at once. "Look around," Jake said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent recreation area. "How many of you are here for crimes against the state? Raise your hands." About half the prisoners raised their hands, tentacles, claws, or appropriate appendages. "How many of you are here for economic crimes? Smuggling, tax evasion, unlicensed trade?" Another quarter of the hands went up. "How many of you are here because you belonged to the wrong political party, practiced the wrong religion, or just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time?" The remaining hands went up slowly, reluctantly, as if the prisoners were afraid to admit they'd been victims rather than criminals. "So let me get this straight," Jake continued. "Most of you are here not because you're dangerous, but because you inconvenienced someone in power. And instead of working together to fix that problem, you've been sitting in your cells for decades, centuries even, accepting that this is just how things are." A voice from the Zephyrian section called out, "What are you suggesting, human?" "I'm suggesting we stop thinking like prisoners and start thinking like people who've been wronged, people who deserve better, people who can work together to get what they deserve." "That's mutiny talk," Guard Captain Thok said, stepping forward with his weapon drawn. "No," Jake replied calmly. "That's union talk. There's a difference. Mutiny is violent and disorganized. Unions are peaceful and extremely organized. They are also perfectly legal under Galactic Council Labor Relations Code, Section 4.7, subsection 12. Guard Captain Thok's weapon hand wavered. That's for civilian workers, not prisoners." "Actually," piped up a voice from the Crystalline Collective, "according to the Galactic Council's Sentient Rights Charter, all beings retain basic labor rights, regardless of incarceration status. It's rarely enforced, but it is technically law." Jake smiled. "See, this is what happens when people start talking to each other instead of punching each other." What followed was the most unusual labor negotiation in galactic history. Over the next several hours, prisoners who had been enemies for centuries began discussing their working conditions. Because that's what prison was when you really thought about it. A workplace where the job was serving time, and the working conditions were deliberately awful. "I demand better food," announced a mollusk from Block B. "I demand recreational time that doesn't involve violence," added a feathered serpent from Block D. "I demand contact with our families," called out one of the hive minds. "I demand to know why I'm here," said a small, mouse-like creature who had apparently been in solitary confinement for so long he'd forgotten his own crime. Guard Captain Thok looked around the recreation area with growing panic. This wasn't a riot. He knew how to handle riots. This was something much worse. This was organization. "You can't just demand things," he protested. "This is a prison, not a hotel." "You're right," Jake agreed. "It's a workplace, and according to Galactic Council regulations, workers have the right to organize, petition for better conditions, and collectively bargain for fair treatment. Unless, of course, the Galactic Council has been breaking its own laws for 847 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Guard Captain Thok's reptilian brain was working overtime, trying to process the implications of what Jake had just said. Because if the human was right, if the prisoners technically had legal rights that were being violated, then everyone, from the guards, to the warden, to the Galactic Council itself, could be in serious trouble. "This is ridiculous," Captain Thok finally sputtered. "You're all criminals. You don't have rights." "Actually," said Gordak quietly, "we do. I should know. I helped write the original prison codes. We have the right to humane treatment, the right to communication, the right to fair work assignments, and the right to petition for redress of grievances. The fact that these rights have been ignored doesn't make them invalid." Jake looked around the recreation area at hundreds of prisoners from dozens of species, all of them staring at him with something they hadn't felt in decades: hope. "So here's what we're going to do," Jake said. "We're going to file a formal complaint with the Galactic Council Labor Relations Board. We're going to demand an investigation into working conditions at this facility. And we're going to do it all completely legally, using the system's own rules against itself." "And if they refuse?" asked Crunch. Jake's smile was sharp enough to cut through the energy barriers. "Then we go on strike. All of us. Every single prisoner in this facility. We stop cooperating with the system until the system starts cooperating with us." Guard Captain Thok's hand moved toward his communication device, but Jake held up a finger. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Captain, because if you report this conversation to Warden Grixtall, you'll have to explain why you allowed it to happen in the first place, and I'm betting he's the kind of boss who shoots the messenger." Captain Thok's hand froze. Because Jake was absolutely right. Warden Grixtall was exactly that kind of boss. Besides, Jake continued, what are you going to tell him? That the prisoners are following the law, that they're exercising their legal rights, that they're being peaceful and organized instead of violent and chaotic? For the first time in his career, Guard Captain Thok was completely out of his depth. He'd been trained to handle riots, escape attempts, and various forms of alien violence. He had no idea how to handle prisoners who were being annoyingly reasonable. This isn't over, he said finally, holstering his weapon. You're right, Jake agreed. It's just beginning. As the guards herded the prisoners back to their cells, Jake caught the eye of every species leader, every informal prison boss, every respected elder who had influence over their fellow inmates. And in that moment, something unprecedented happened in the galactic penitentiary of Zorblex Prime. For the first time in 847 years, the prisoners had a leader. And that leader was a human who'd been in the place for less than a week. Up in his command center, Warden Grixtall watched the security feeds with growing unease. He couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed, but something was definitely different. The prisoners were talking to each other across species lines. They were making eye contact with the guards. They were moving with purpose instead of shuffling with defeat. Lieutenant Korb, he called out, his voice carrying a note of concern he tried to hide. Run a full security diagnostic. Check all systems, all protocols, all procedures. Something's happening down there, and I want to know what it is. Little did he know that what was happening was the most dangerous thing that could happen in any prison. The inmates were thinking, and they were thinking together. Phase 1 of Jake's plan was complete. The prisoners had been united. Now it was time for Phase 2. The actual escape. The next morning arrived with all the subtlety of a supernova, though Warden Grixtall didn't realize it yet. He was too busy reviewing the overnight security reports, which showed absolutely nothing unusual. No attempted breakouts, no riots, no violence of any kind. In fact, the prisoners had been remarkably well-behaved, almost suspiciously well-behaved. Everything seems quiet, Lieutenant Korb reported, his slug-like form rippling with what might have been relief. All prisoners accounted for, all systems functioning normally. Too quiet, Grixtall muttered, his compound eyes scanning the monitors. I don't like it when they're quiet. Loud prisoners are angry prisoners. Angry prisoners are predictable prisoners. Quiet prisoners are planning something. He had no idea how right he was. Down in Block C, Jake was having what appeared to be a perfectly normal conversation with his cellmates. To anyone listening, it sounded like idle chatter about the quality of the morning's breakfast slop. But Jake had spent enough time in enough questionable establishments to know how to have two conversations at once. Pass the salt, Jake said to Vex, which, in their newly established code, meant begin Phase 1. Vex nodded and reached for the salt shaker, while simultaneously tapping out a message on the cell wall in a rhythm that sounded like random noise but was actually a complex pattern that the Crystalline Collective had taught him. The message traveled through the prison's ventilation system, carried by harmonic frequencies that the security sensors couldn't detect. Salt's a bit stale today, Nibbler commented, which meant message received and understood in their abbreviated communication system. Yeah, but the bread's not bad, Gordak added, which was the signal for all systems ready, waiting for your command. Jake smiled and took a bite of what the prison generously called breakfast. I think it's going to be a beautiful day. That was the signal. Throughout the prison, in every block, in every cell, prisoners who had been enemies for centuries began moving with synchronized precision. It wasn't the kind of obvious dramatic movement that would trigger alarms. It was the kind of subtle, coordinated action that looked completely natural unless you knew what to look for. The Zephyrians in Block A, who hadn't spoken to anyone in 60 years, suddenly developed an urgent need to use the communal washroom. All of them, at the same time. This created a bottleneck that required Guard Sergeant Womp to redirect his patrol route, which meant he was 30 seconds behind schedule. The Crystalline Collective in Block B began their morning meditation ritual, which involved a low, harmonic humming that was perfectly legal and completely within their rights. The fact that this humming created a frequency that interfered with the prison's communication systems was, of course, purely coincidental. The hive minds in Block D did something truly unprecedented. They stopped arguing with themselves. The sudden silence was so unnerving that the guards assigned to that block gathered around the cells, trying to figure out what was wrong. This left the corridor checkpoint temporarily understaffed. In the maximum security wing, the most dangerous prisoners in the galaxy were having what appeared to be a philosophical discussion about the nature of existence. In reality, they were passing along a message that had originated from a human in Block C. translated through 17 different languages, and somehow still retained its essential meaning, "Today we go home." "Sir," Lieutenant Korb called out from his monitoring station. "I'm getting some unusual readings from the harmonics sensors." "Define unusual," Grickstall replied, not looking up from his reports. "Well, it appears that prisoners in multiple blocks are engaging in simultaneous cultural activities. The Zephyrians are bathing, the Crystalline Collective is meditating, the hive minds are being contemplative, and the maximum security prisoners are having intellectual discussions." Grickstall's head snapped up. "All at the same time?" "Yes, sir. It's actually quite remarkable. I've never seen such widespread cultural engagement in—" "You idiot!" Grickstall screamed, his mandibles clicking in alarm. "That's not cultural engagement. That's coordination. Sound the alarm." But it was too late, because while Lieutenant Korb had been admiring the prisoner's sudden interest in personal hygiene and spiritual enlightenment, Jake Morrison had put the second phase of his plan into motion. The beauty of Jake's escape plan wasn't that it was technologically advanced or militarily brilliant. The beauty was that it was embarrassingly simple. He had realized something that 8 centuries of security experts had missed. The prison's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. The galactic penitentiary of Zorblex Prime had been designed to be absolutely, completely, 100% escape-proof. Every system had backups. Every backup had redundancies. Every redundancy had fail-safes. It was a masterpiece of over-engineering that could handle any conceivable threat. Except for one thing. It had never been designed to handle prisoners who actually wanted to work together. "Attention all prisoners!" Jake's voice echoed through the prison's communication system, though how he'd gained access to it was a mystery that would puzzle investigators for years. "This is your shop steward speaking. As of right now, we are officially on strike." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every prisoner in the facility simply stopped cooperating with the system. They didn't attack the guards. They didn't try to break down doors. They didn't do anything violent or destructive. They just stopped. Stopped following orders. Stopped returning to their cells. Stopped pretending that they were powerless. "This is Warden Grickstall," came the panicked voice over the intercom. "All prisoners return to your cells immediately. This is not a drill." "Sorry, Warden," Jake replied, somehow having gained access to the prison's PA system. "But we're exercising our legal right to strike. According to Galactic Council Labor Relations Code Section 4.7, subsection 12, workers have the right to cease work activities in order to negotiate for better working conditions. And our working conditions here are, frankly, terrible. You're prisoners, not workers. Actually, we're both. We work in the laundry facilities, the kitchen, the maintenance departments, and the administrative offices. We perform labor that keeps this facility running. That makes us workers, and workers have rights." In the control room, Grickstall was frantically pressing buttons that were supposed to activate emergency protocols. But the emergency protocols had been designed to handle riots, not labor disputes. They were designed to deal with violence, not passive resistance. "Deploy the riot suppression units," he screamed at Lieutenant Korb. "Sir, there's no riot to suppress. The prisoners are just standing around, talking to each other. Some of them are singing work songs." "Then deploy the isolation protocols. Separate them." "Sir, the isolation protocols require the prisoners to cooperate with being moved to isolation cells. They're not cooperating." "Then use the stun weapons." "Sir, the stun weapons are designed for self-defense against violent attackers. Using them on peaceful protesters would be a violation of the Galactic Council's use of force regulations." Grickstall stared at his lieutenant with the expression of someone who had just realized that his entire worldview was fundamentally flawed. "Are you telling me that we have no way to deal with prisoners who are following the law?" "It appears so, sir." Meanwhile, throughout the prison, something beautiful was happening. Species that had been enemies for millennia were working together. The Zephyrians were sharing their silent communication techniques with the Crystalline Collective. The hive minds were teaching the hammer fists about group decision-making. The tiny Squarelian warriors were coordinating with the massive Boulderites to create the most unlikely security teams in galactic history. "You know what I love about this?" Jake said to his cellmates as they watched the chaos unfold through their cell's viewing port. "We're not breaking any laws, we're not destroying any property, we're not hurting anyone. We're just refusing to pretend that this is okay." "It's brilliant," Vex admitted, his forearms working to jam the cell door's locking mechanism with components from his long-abandoned plasma cutter project. "You've turned their own system against them." "Not just turned it against them," Nibbler corrected, standing on Gordak's shoulder to get a better view of the corridor. "You've made it irrelevant. They built this place to contain criminals, but we're not acting like criminals anymore. We're acting like people. People who've been wronged, Gordak added quietly. People who deserve better. The cell door clicked open, not because Vex had finally perfected his plasma cutter, but because Jake had convinced Guard Sergeant Blurks to unlock it. The gelatinous guard had been so flustered by the sudden breakdown in prison protocol that he'd simply followed Jake's calm, reasonable suggestion to open the doors so we can discuss this like civilized beings. Phase 3, Jake announced as he stepped into the corridor for the first time as a free man. Now we negotiate. But negotiation was the last thing on Warden Grixtall's mind. He was currently in the middle of what mental health professionals would later describe as a complete psychotic break. His carefully ordered world, his perfect prison, his 847-year streak of no successful escapes had all been shattered by a human who'd been in the facility for less than a week. "Security teams to all blocks," he screamed into his communicator. "Use whatever force necessary to restore order." "Sir," came the hesitant reply. "The security teams are reporting that there's nothing to use force against. The prisoners are just standing there, talking. Some of them are asking about the prison's employee handbook." "There is no employee handbook. They're prisoners." "Actually, sir, according to the Galactic Council regulations, all beings performing labor are entitled to—" "I don't care about regulations," Grixtall shrieked. "I care about maintaining order. I care about security. I care about my perfect record." That's when Jake Morrison's voice came over the intercom one more time, calm and reasonable and absolutely infuriating in its politeness. "Warden Grixtall, this is Jake Morrison, acting shop steward for the Galactic Penitentiary Workers Union. We'd like to request a meeting to discuss our working conditions and negotiate a fair resolution to this labor dispute. We're willing to meet at your convenience, though I should mention that until we reach an agreement, we'll be continuing our strike. Oh, and Warden, you might want to call the Galactic Council, because according to the records I've been reviewing, this facility has been operating in violation of about 300 different labor laws for the past 8 centuries. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about that." The silence that followed was the sound of a warden realizing that his career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his perfect prison had been conquered not by violence or technology, but by a human who'd read the employee handbook. "Sir?" Lieutenant Korb asked tentatively. "What are your orders?" Grixtall looked around his command center, at the screens showing hundreds of prisoners moving freely through the corridors, talking and laughing, and acting like the free beings they'd just become. He looked at his security systems, all of them useless against an enemy that refused to be an enemy. He looked at his perfect record, lying in ruins at his feet. "Get me the Galactic Council," he said finally, his voice hollow with defeat. "Tell them we have a situation." "What kind of situation, sir?" Grixtall's mandibles clicked one final time. "Tell them we've been unionized." And in that moment, Jake Morrison had done something that no one had managed to do in 847 years. He hadn't just escaped from the galactic penitentiary of Zorbalex Prime. He had liberated it. The emergency meeting with the Galactic Council was, by all accounts, the most awkward video conference in the history of interstellar politics. On one side of the screen sat the 12 most powerful beings in the galaxy, arranged in their traditional semicircle of authority. On the other side sat Warden Grixtall, whose purple carapace had turned a sickly shade of green, and Jake Morrison, who looked like he was having the time of his life. "Let me understand this correctly," said Counselor Vexthara, a crystalline being whose voice sounded like wind chimes made of pure disdain. "You are telling us that your maximum security prison has been unionized?" "That's correct," Jake replied cheerfully, completely ignoring the fact that he was technically still a prisoner addressing the most powerful governmental body in known space. Local 847 of the Galactic Penitentiary Workers Union, officially recognized under Article 23 of the Galactic Labor Relations Code. "Local 847? asked Counselor Mordak, a tentacled creature who served as the Council's legal expert. "Why 847? "Because this place went 847 years without a successful escape. We thought it was appropriate." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either applause or executions. In this case, it was more likely to be the latter. "Warden Grixtall," said Counselor Zethkal, the Council's security advisor. "Explain to us how this happened." Grixtall's mandibles clicked nervously. "Well, sir, it started when we received a human prisoner for routine incarceration. Standard protocol, nothing unusual. But then he began—" "Began what?" Zethkal demanded. "Began being nice to the guards." Grixtall finished miserably. The council stared at him, then at Jake, then back at him. "I'm sorry," said Counselor Vexthara slowly. "Did you just say that your maximum security prison was compromised because a prisoner was nice?" "It's more complicated than that," Jake interjected. "You see, your prison system has a fundamental flaw. It was designed to contain criminals, not to rehabilitate people. It was built to punish, not to provide justice. And most importantly, it was created to maintain order through fear, rather than through respect." "And?" Counselor Mordak asked, though his tone suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. "And when you treat people like people instead of like problems to be managed, they tend to respond positively. Who knew?" Up in the prison's recreation area, the revolution was in full swing. But it wasn't the kind of revolution that involved violence or destruction. It was the kind of revolution that involved Crunch the Hammer Fist Warrior teaching origami to a group of Zephyrian assassins, while Nibbler led a discussion group about conflict resolution techniques. "You know what I just realized?" said one of the Crystalline Collective members, his faceted form refracting the light into rainbow patterns. "We've been in here for 60 years, and this is the first time I've actually enjoyed myself." "That's because you've been treating this place like a prison," replied a hive mind who had finally stopped arguing with himself. "Jake taught us to treat it like a workplace, and if it's a workplace, then we can make it a better workplace." Meanwhile, the guards were having their own crisis of identity. They had been trained to maintain order through intimidation and force. But how do you intimidate people who are being relentlessly polite to you? How do you use force against people who are following the law more carefully than you are? "I don't understand what's happening," Guard Captain Thok confided to Sergeant Blurks as they watched prisoners from different species sharing meals and swapping stories. "Everything I was taught about prison security is useless now." "Maybe that's the point," Blurks replied thoughtfully. "Maybe the whole system was wrong from the beginning." Back in the video conference, the Galactic Council was coming to some uncomfortable realizations of their own. "Mr. Morrison," said Counselor Vexthara, "what exactly are your demands?" Jake leaned back in his chair, completely at ease despite being surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "Well, first we want better working conditions. The cells are too small, the food is terrible, and the recreational facilities are designed to promote violence rather than rehabilitation." "Those aren't working conditions," Counselor Zethkol protested. "Those are prison conditions." "Same thing, really. If you're going to make people work, you need to provide a safe and healthy work environment. It's basic labor law. Second," Jake continued, "we want educational opportunities. Most of the beings in here are incarcerated for economic crimes or political dissent. Give them job training, teach them useful skills, and maybe they won't end up back in the system. Third, we want family visitation rights. You've got people in here who haven't seen their loved ones in decades. That's not justice, that's cruelty. And fourth," Jake said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "we want a complete review of every sentence handed down by this facility. Because from what I've seen, about half the people in here are political prisoners, and the other half are serving sentences that are completely disproportionate to their crimes." The council members exchanged glances. These weren't the demands of criminals. These were the demands of people who had been wronged by the system and wanted that system to be fixed. "And if we refuse?" asked Counselor Mordak. Jake's smile was sharp enough to cut through the energy barriers that had once contained him. "Then we continue the strike, indefinitely. And I should mention that we've been in contact with prisoners at 17 other facilities throughout the galaxy. They're very interested in our union model." "You're threatening to unionize the entire prison system?" "I'm not threatening anything. I'm just pointing out that people talk to each other, and when people realize they don't have to accept injustice, they tend to stop accepting it." The truth was, Jake had been in contact with exactly 0 other facilities. He didn't even know if there were 17 other facilities. But the Galactic Council didn't know that. And sometimes the best negotiation tactic is to let your opponent's imaginations work against them. "This is preposterous," Counselor Zethkol declared. "You're a criminal. You were caught smuggling illegal goods." "Coffee beans," Jake corrected. "I was caught smuggling coffee beans, without the proper permits, which, by the way, cost more than my entire ship, and require a bureaucratic process that takes 3 years to complete. You want to know why there's so much smuggling in the galaxy? Because your legal system is designed to make legal compliance nearly impossible." That's not the point," Zethkol stammered. "Actually, it is exactly the point. You've created a system where following the law is harder than breaking it, and then you act surprised when people break it. It's like setting up a maze with no exit, and then punishing people for not finding the exit." Counselor Vexthara's crystalline form was beginning to crack under the pressure of the conversation. "What do you want from us, human?" "I want you to do your jobs," Jake replied simply. "I want you to create a justice system that's actually about justice, not about control. I want you to treat people like people, not like problems to be warehoused. And I want you to remember that power without accountability is just tyranny with better marketing." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, Counselor Mordak began to speak. "The human may have a point. Our incarceration rates have been climbing for centuries. Our recidivism rates are astronomical. And our costs are bankrupting entire star systems." "What are you suggesting?" Vexthara asked. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to listen to what the prisoners are actually saying instead of just assuming they're wrong because they're prisoners." "You want to negotiate with criminals?" "I want to negotiate with people," Mordak corrected. "People who might know something about the flaws in our system that we've been too proud to see." And that's when Jake Morrison did something that no one expected, least of all himself. He stood up, walked over to the window overlooking the prison's main corridor, and said something that would be quoted in political science textbooks for generations to come. "You know what the funny thing is? I never actually wanted to escape from this place." The room went silent. Even the humming of the prison's energy system seemed to pause. "What?" Warden Grixtal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to escape. I just wanted to prove a point. See, I've been in a lot of prisons, and they all have the same problem. They're designed by people who've never been prisoners, run by people who've never been prisoners, and funded by people who've never been prisoners. None of you have any idea what it's actually like to be trapped in a system that treats you like you're not quite human." Jake turned back to face the camera, his expression serious for the first time since the video conference had begun. "I spent 3 days in this place, and I saw beings who had been broken by centuries of institutionalized cruelty. I saw people who had forgotten what it felt like to have hope. I saw a system that was designed to punish rather than to heal, to control rather than to help, to maintain order rather than to create justice. And I decided that wasn't okay, so I did something about it." "You organized a prison break," Counselor Zethkal said accusingly. "No," Jake corrected. "I organized people. I reminded them that they were people. I showed them that they had rights, and that those rights meant something. And you know what happened? They started acting like people instead of prisoners. They started working together instead of fighting each other. They started building something better instead of just enduring something terrible." Jake walked back to his chair and sat down, his casual demeanor returning. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to agree to our demands, you're going to reform your prison system, you're going to start treating people like people, and in return, we're going to show you that rehabilitation actually works better than punishment." "And if we refuse?" Vexthara asked. Jake's smile was equal parts friendly and terrifying. "Then I'm going to stay right here, in this prison, and I'm going to keep organizing. I'm going to keep reminding people that they have rights. I'm going to keep showing them that they don't have to accept injustice. And eventually, your entire system is going to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions." "You're threatening the stability of the galaxy," Counselor Zethkal protested. "No," Jake replied. "I'm threatening the stability of an unjust system. There's a difference. A just system doesn't need to fear people who organize for justice. Only an unjust system needs to fear that." The Galactic Council deliberated for exactly 17 minutes. When they returned, Counselor Mordak was the one who spoke. "We accept your terms, Mr. Morrison. We will begin immediate reforms to the prison system, starting with this facility. We will review all sentences as you've requested. We will improve conditions and provide educational opportunities. And we will establish a prisoner advocacy program to ensure that these reforms are maintained." "Excellent," Jake said. "Oh, and one more thing. I want Warden Grixtal to keep his job." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Grixtal himself looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "What?" he stammered. "You heard me. You're going to keep your job, but you're going to do it differently. You're going to run this place like a rehabilitation center instead of a punishment facility. You're going to treat the people here like people instead of problems. And you're going to remember that your job is to help them become better, not to make them suffer." "But why?" Grixtal asked, his voice filled with confusion. Jake's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, even wardens who've been doing their jobs wrong for 847 years. The question is, what are you going to do with yours?" And that, dear listeners, is the story of how Jake Morrison, small-time smuggler and professional disappointment to his mother, accidentally started a revolution that changed the galaxy forever. Not with violence or technology or military genius, but with the simple revolutionary idea that people should be treated like people. 6 months later, the galactic penitentiary of Zorblex Prime had been transformed into the Galactic Rehabilitation Center of Zorblex Prime. Crime rates throughout the galaxy had dropped to their lowest levels in recorded history. The prison system had been restructured from top to bottom, with a focus on education, job training, and psychological support rather than punishment and control. And Jake Morrison? Well, he stayed exactly where he was. Not because he was still a prisoner, but because he had found his calling. He became the galaxy's first director of prisoner advocacy, working within the system to make sure that what had happened at Zorblex Prime spread to every correctional facility in known space. "You know what I learned?" Jake said during his first annual report to the Galactic Council. "The most dangerous thing in the universe isn't a weapon or a virus or a black hole. It's a person who refuses to accept that things have to be the way they are. Because once people realize they have the power to change things, there's no limit to what they can accomplish. Even if they're just a small-time smuggler who got caught with unlicensed coffee beans." Jake's laugh echoed through the council chambers. "Especially then, because sometimes the most ordinary people are the ones who can do the most extraordinary things. They just need someone to remind them that they have the power to do it." And with that, Jake Morrison, accidental revolutionary and professional optimist, got back to work. Because there was still a galaxy full of people who needed to be reminded that they mattered, that they had rights, and that they had the power to make things better. After all, someone had to keep the powerful honest, and who better to do it than a human who'd learned that the best way to break the system is to make it work the way it was always supposed to work in the first place. The revolution, it turned out, wasn't about tearing things down. It was about building them back up, the right way, one person at a time.